I know we will probably have other people joining us, but perhaps we should get started. My name is Dr. Jennifer Lee Disney, and I am Chair of the Department of Political Science and Director of the Women's and Gender Studies program, which is housed at the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies. All of whom are sponsoring this event today, along with the John C. West Forum on Politics and Policy. And the director of the John C. West Forum on Politics and Policy, Professor Katerina Moyen, and I are thrilled to invite back our colleague and friend, Dr. Karen Kudrowski, who was at Winthrop for how many years, Karen? A quarter century? More than a quarter century?
24 and a half.
We'll give you that other half. We'll call it 25, a quarter century. Karen was the chair of the department when I was hired. Karen was the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. Karen led our Civic Engagement Institute. She co-directed the John C. West Forum on Politics and Policy, and we're thrilled to have her back. She's now executive directing the Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women in Politics, so she's a perfect person to be the fourth speaker in our Women's Centennial, the Women's Suffrage Centennial event series that we have been doing this fall. And we're just thrilled to invite you back, Karen, and we're thrilled to have you speak today on Hard Won, Not Done, Suffrage History in the United States. I think Professor Moyen has even more she wants to say about you, so I'm going to turn it over to her, but I'll say welcome back, Karen, and thrilled to have you, and thanks everybody for being here today.
Thank you, Dr. Disney. I feel like we're all in the same room, and I'm a little bit jumping for joy on my end over here. It's so nice to be with my colleagues again. First, I'd like to just have a couple of housekeeping announcements for students. If you're looking to get cultural event credit today, please make sure you use your actual name in your ID, your first name and your last name, so that we can identify you. Also, there's a survey that I'll send out toward the end of this event today with some questions that you need to fill out for cultural event credit. And finally, if you have questions throughout the event, please put them in the comment section, the little comment bubble on the right-hand side of your screen, so that we can ask Dr. Kudrowski. There will be a little Q&A period at the end of the event. Now, to introduce Dr. Kudrowski, she is the director of the Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women in Politics and a professor of political science at Iowa State University. The Catt Center conducts research on women in politics with a focus on Iowa and promotes civic engagement. In addition to her duties at the Catt Center, Dr. Kudrowski teaches courses in American politics and conducts research on women in American politics and civic engagement. She joined the Iowa State faculty in January of 2019. Dr. Kudrowski is a graduate of the University of Minnesota Twin Cities and the University of Oklahoma Norman. Prior to coming to Iowa State, she spent 24 and a half years at Winthrop University, Rock Hill, South Carolina, where she served in many roles, including the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. She also received Winthrop's highest faculty honor, Distinguished Professor, in 2011. Dr. Kudrowski is a professor emeritus at Winthrop University, and we're just thrilled to have her back today. Welcome.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Get a thumbs up? Okay, great. I will share my screen, which I've now figured out how to do, so I'm feeling very technologically savvy. And it's wonderful to be back. My only regret is that I am not there in person, which I had hoped to do so that I could certainly visit with all my friends. But here we are in a pandemic, so I'm glad that our technology enables us to do this long distance. So as everybody noted, the title of today's lecture is Hard Won and Not Done, and it is a very brief history of suffrage. So for those of you who have read some of the many tomes about the suffrage movement, I apologize in advance for what I'm sure is not going to be nearly a complete history. Okay, so first thing, what's all the a few words of just to make sure that we have a common vocabulary. Here we use the term suffrage or franchise interchangeably, and they both mean that the right to vote. In the United States, we refer to suffrage advocates as suffragists, not suffragettes. Suffragette was used as a derisive term in the United States as a way of sort of minimizing or making fun of, infantilizing the suffrage advocates. Interestingly enough, in Britain, the suffrage advocates actually adopted the term suffragette. So they adopted it and made it their own. So in Britain, it's the official, sort of accepted term, but not in the United States. I think a similar thing that we've seen in the United States recently is that the word Obamacare as a shorthand for the Affordable Care Act, which at first was meant to be a derisive term and now has been adopted by President Obama and other advocates for the law. Okay, and then starting off with the Constitution of 1787. That would be the one that was written before there were any amendments added. Notably, the Constitution does not define who should have the right to vote. It refers to electors, in this case meaning voters, and it says that the people who vote for the U.S. House of Representatives need to be the same people that elect the more numerous House of the state legislature, but leaves that definition up to the states. So the Constitution also says that the time, place, and manner of elections is delegated to the states, something that we see playing out even today with different states' registration deadlines and requirements for absentee voting and things like that. What it meant in 1787 is that effectively the people who were allowed to vote were white male property owners over the age of 21. The kind of property that, whether it was a business or a farm or a plantation, was left up to the states, but essentially it boiled down to you had to pay some sort of property taxes. You had to be a taxpayer. That was only about 6% of the population in the 1780s. The 19th Amendment, which is the subject of today's conversation, is actually very short. It's only 2 sentences long. And it's there, so I won't read it to you, but let me point out 2 things that I think are interesting about this. Number 1 is that it is very deliberately patterned as closely as possible after the language of the 15th Amendment. And for the historians in the crowd, you'll remember that the 15th Amendment prohibits the denial of voting rights on the basis of race or previous condition of servitude, right? So instead of race and previous condition of servitude, what we have here is the word sex. Another thing that's pretty interesting about this is that the 19th Amendment contains no pronouns. And for the linguists among you, you would understand that the pronoun he was perceived or accepted to be inclusive of both men and women. And the word he appears actually in the 14th Amendment, and Susan B. Anthony wanted to use that as a basis to argue that women had the right to vote because it talks about not denying due process and so forth. Essentially, the courts decided that the word he, the pronoun he, is inclusive of both sexes except when it's not inclusive of both sexes. So to avoid any of that sort of confusion, the 19th Amendment was written to not have any pronouns. Okay, oops, let me go back. So the women's suffrage movement, in a gross oversimplification, dates itself from the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. And that was called by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who is on the right side of this photograph. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was an abolitionist and active in all sorts of progressive movements of the day, but especially the abolition movement, which is, of course, the one to banish slavery. And she and Lucretia Mott in 1840 attended an international abolitionist conference in London. Notably, they would have had to travel by ship. It would have been a very long journey. It would have been expensive and arduous. So for them to undertake this journey, even if both Stanton and Mott were traveling with their husbands, was no small feat. And Lucretia Mott was actually an elected delegate from the United States to this international abolitionist conference. And And when they arrived, the conference was sent into a tizzy. All the delegates spent the better part of the first day trying to decide about what to do because these cheeky Americans sent women to the conference. And at the time, it was not acceptable for women to engage in public life at all. They couldn't speak in public, they couldn't be ministers, and to attend a conference, much less as a voting delegate, which is what Mott was really considered absolutely beyond the pale. So Stanton and Mott were allowed to stay in the convention, but they could not participate. They had to sit in the back behind a screen, and they were absolutely enraged. They couldn't vote and they could not speak at all in the convention. So Stanton and Mott decided that it was not merely enslaved persons who needed some liberation, but that they themselves faced some significant barriers. 8 years later, they got together and they held a women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York. Seneca Falls is a town that's about the size of York, South Carolina, and it was a little bit smaller when it happened, but nonetheless, it became a hotbed of the women's rights movement. And at this Seneca Falls convention, the people who attended passed a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, which had been drafted by Stanton. And it is very deliberately patterned closely after the Declaration of Independence. And it says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. And at the part in the Declaration of Independence where Jefferson starts to list all of the grievances that the American colonists have against King George, at that point Stanton starts to list the number of grievances that women face in the social and political system of the day, and to call for a number of reforms. All of the reforms that are included, save one, were passed actually without a great deal of consternation or controversy. They had been part of the conversation for some time before that, but the one that actually deeply divided the convention and nearly failed as to be included was the call for suffrage. And most of the people who attended were in fact involved in the abolitionist movement, and I'll be talking some more about many of those folks as well. Interestingly enough, African Americans who were involved in the abolitionist movement had been talking about equal rights for all, which was perceived to be inclusive of women, even if it didn't expressly say so, as early as 1836. Stanton, after the Seneca Falls Convention, partnered with Susan B. Anthony. Anthony herself did not attend the Seneca Falls Convention, but she was introduced by Amelia Bloomer. If any of you women out there are wearing pants, you can thank Amelia Bloomer for this. She was a fashion advocate, an abolitionist, a temperance advocate, and a women's suffrage advocate. And at the time, she lived in Seneca Falls, and she introduced Stanton to Anthony, and Stanton then recruited Anthony, who had been active in the temperance movement and the abolition movement, into the suffrage cause. And the two of them became absolute forces of nature. As Stanton styled herself as sort of the intellectual leader of the movement, and Anthony was the mouthpiece. Anthony was single, she was childless, so she was able to travel around the country, which she did often in the worst of weather in the coldest months so that she wouldn't compete with other people on the lecture circuit, and she would give the speeches that were drafted, crafted and perfected by Stanton. Stanton herself was married and had 6 children, and her domestic responsibilities did not allow her to travel as much as Anthony did, but she did become nationally prominent along with many other suffragists of the day. As Stanton put it, I forged the thunderbolts and Anthony threw them. One interesting parenthetical fact that I need to throw in here, because I am sitting in the state of Iowa, is that after Amelia Bloomer changed history by introducing Stanton and Anthony, she and her husband actually moved to Iowa and settled in Council Bluffs, where she continued to advocate for another number of progressive causes and was nationally prominent for her day. The suffrage movement continued to advocate for, as a part of a broad number of progressive causes, such as, abolition, equal rights more generally, and so forth, through the Civil War. And then the movement split. split. And it split over the 15th Amendment. The suffragists sincerely hoped that the 15th Amendment would be used to not only ban discrimination and voting on the basis of race or previous condition of servitude, but they hoped that the word sex would be included. And it was not. And it was not because there were sort of two related arguments that were made. One was that the United States could only handle one major reform at a time, and if they had to choose between race and sex, that it was deserving to go to African American men. So even though the 15th Amendment does not actually say anything about sex or African American men, the 14th Amendment includes the word male. And so the 15th Amendment was understood at the time to apply only to African American men. Now, there were a lot of suffragists, actually the bulk of them, that supported this, the 15th Amendment. And they wanted to see women's suffrage added by state action. Stanton and Anthony started a rival organization where they wanted to continue to support moving forward with a federal amendment. Okay, so we move along. The suffrage movement then remains separated and split for another 20 years. And then 1890 comes along, and it becomes sort of a really banner and important year for a number of reasons. So first of all, the two factions of the suffrage movement joined forces again, and they renamed themselves in honor of both of these competing suffrage organizations. And the new name of the organization is the National American Woman Suffrage Association, which I will refer to by its acronym, which is NAWSA. So that was one thing that happened in 1890. The second thing that happened in 1890 is that Wyoming becomes a state. And Wyoming, in its statehood petition, says we want women to vote. And during at the point when Wyoming was a territory, they had already included women as voters. However, when they moved to statehood, Congress saw this statehood petition and essentially wrote back saying, "Are you sure about this woman thing?" And the governor of Wyoming responded on behalf of the state is, "We would prefer to remain a territory than to enter as a state without our women." And so Congress granted Wyoming statehood petition, and then we had the first state that had granted women's suffrage. The third thing that happened is that Carrie Chapman Catt, who is pictured here on the right, joins NAWSA and attends her first national convention. Now, at this point, Susan B. Anthony is the national leader. She becomes the first president of NAWSA, the new merged organization. She also realizes that she is not going to live to see the fruits of her life's work, and that it is time to turn over the leadership of the movement to the next generation of suffrage leaders. So she identifies a number of women, younger women, as her proteges, and she mentors them to take over the suffrage movement. These were often referred to as Auntie Susan's nieces, even though they did not have any blood relationship. That was a term that was given to sort of refer to this group collectively. And one of these was Carrie Chapman Catt, who was in her 20s at the time. She had recently, 10 years before, had graduated from the Iowa State University at the time, which is one reason why we have the Carrie Chapman Catt Center here at Iowa State. And she caught Susan B. Anthony's eye, and she became active in the national suffrage movement. Among the things that she did was she went to Colorado in 1893 and pretty much single-handedly organized a pro-suffrage referendum. And Colorado then became the second state to enfranchise women and the first one to do it by a popular referendum, often thanks to the energy and the talents of Carrie Chapman Catt. Kat also traveled around the country with Susan B. Anthony. They did a swing through the American South in 1895. And what would happen is that Susan B. Anthony, who was in her late 70s or 80s, would start the speeches, and whenever she got tired, she would sit down, and then Carrie Chapman Catt would stand up and take over. They were both reached national prominence, and their appearance was actually quite a big deal when they came to visit any particular town. Carrie Chapman Catt then became Susan B. Anthony's handpicked successor as president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And she served from 1900 to 1904. She stepped down in 1904 to care for her second husband, George Catt, who was ailing. After he passed away, she traveled the world and worked on international suffrage causes, and then she was drafted again to return to the presidency in 1915. And so she led NASA during that last push to get the amendment ratified. And in 1960, she unveiled what she called her winning plan. And what the winning plan was that states that could continue to expand suffrage by state action, that they would continue to do so. But those states that had already enacted some portion of suffrage, or that were not likely to enact suffrage at the state level, would all advocate for a federal amendment, which would then cover all women in the United States. So she wanted to do both things at the same time, work at the state level and work at the federal level. Interestingly enough, Kat came back to NASA at a time when there was yet another schism in the suffrage movement. And while Kat led NASA, which was sort of the mainstream organization, a young woman who was representative of the third generation of suffragists had come to the United States and was leading and began to lead an organization that eventually split with NASA. And that is Alice Paul, or I should say Dr. Alice Paul, because Alice Paul is the first woman who received a PhD in political science. So I'm very fond of her for that reason, if for nothing else. And she founded the National Woman's Party in 1917. Alice Paul came to the suffrage cause when she was studying in England, where she encountered the suffragettes, especially the Pankhursts, who were active in England. And for those of you who know even a little bit about the British suffrage movement, the British suffrage movement was far more militant than the American suffrage movement. They had violence, they had riots, they would break store windows, they would destroy personal property. One suffragette even committed suicide by standing in front of the king's horse during a horse race, and she was trampled to death. And so these militant tactics inspired Paul, and she became active in this movement and was eventually arrested. And she brought some of those tactics back to the United States. The part that she did not bring back, because she was a pacifist and a Quaker, was the tactic of violence. But she did bring back the tactic of peaceful demonstration, and she brought back the tactic of holding the party in power accountable. So a couple of her absolutely major contributions is that she organized a huge parade in Washington, D.C. in 1913 on the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. In fact, Woodrow Wilson showed up at Union Station and the place was absolutely emptied out. He was expecting crowds and a band and all that sort of stuff. And he said, "Where is everybody?" And they said, "Oh, everybody is watching the suffrage parade." And the suffrage parade was actually a huge, remarkable, beautifully laid out sort of pageantry where women used their bodies and their physical presence to demonstrate their strength in numbers and their commitment to the suffrage cause. And they came from all over the country. And then in 1917, she organized a group known as the Silent Sentinels. And these were women who brought banners, dressed in their very best clothes, and stood outside the White House 6 days a week in all kinds of weather. And the banners that they held called attention to their desire for suffrage. What I find really remarkable about this is that this is the first time that there is an organized protest outside of the White House. Now, when you go to Washington, D.C., protests are outside the White House. Anywhere from, I don't know, 1 to 17 groups might be protesting outside the White House. The last 4 times that I've been to D.C., the same group has been protesting outside the White House. So this is pretty routine and an accepted part of our American political culture right now. But in 1917, it was brand new. And as the United States entered World War I, these pickets and protesters became much more controversial and embarrassing to the Wilson administration, especially when they burned Wilson in effigy, when they read language from his speeches about, wanting to promote democracy abroad and then pointing out the hypocrisy of not having democracy at home. All these kinds of demonstrations led to actually over 200 of these picketers, these suffragists, to be, including Alice Paul and her first lieutenant, Lucy Burns, to be arrested and jailed at the Occoquan prison. There, they were not allowed to speak to attorneys. They were not allowed access to the news. They could not send out letters or receive letters. Paul herself was kept in solitary confinement and was forced to undergo psychiatric evaluation. They wanted to declare her insane. They were fed food that was filled with sawdust and maggots. One of the games that they would play was to count who had the most maggots in their food that they were fed. And to protest these conditions, Paul then led a number of about 35 suffragists in yet another strategy that was brought back from England, which was the hunger strike. And many of these women became seriously ill because of the food deprivation, including Paul herself, and they were force-fed. And they were force-fed 3 times a day, and the force feedings were brutal. They shoved a hose either down their throat or through their nose into their throat, and then they forced down a combination of milk and eggs that led them to vomit repeatedly. And often, too, these women ended up with, nosebleeds, injuries, problems with their teeth. It was a very brutal practice and quite torturous. And the word got out about this treatment, and it led to such a public outcry that all of the women then had to were released, the charges against them were dropped, and it actually placed more pressure on Wilson, who then allied with Carrie Chapman Catt and came out in favor of the federal amendment. Interestingly enough, both Catt and Paul claimed some credit for actually persuading Wilson to come out in favor of the 19th Amendment, and quite frankly, I think they're both right. Catt would not have had the access that she had without Alice Paul and her militant tactics. Okay, I do want to point out especially that this was not an all-white movement by any stretch of the imagination, and that African Americans partnered with white suffragists and worked alongside them throughout the history of the suffrage movement. I want to point out very prominent ones, though this is by any means not an exhaustive list. It just scratches the surface of the really remarkable people who were involved who happen to be African American. So on the far left, you see Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass, of course, is quite a famous orator and abolitionist, but he also called himself a woman's rights man. And he was throughout his entire his adulthood and his life of activism, he was an ardent suffragist. He was a very good friend of Susan B. Anthony. They lived near each other in Rochester, and Susan B. Anthony actually gave the eulogy at his funeral. And it was Frederick Douglass, who attended the Seneca Falls Convention, who gave such a powerful speech in favor of the suffrage plank in the Declaration of Sentiments that actually carried the day. Otherwise, probably would have been, it probably would have failed. Frederick Douglass, however, was also responsible for not supporting the word sex in the 15th Amendment. He was an ardent supporter of the 15th Amendment as it was written and to the exclusion of women, arguing that African American men faced such dire threats to their physical well-being from lynching and other forms of violence that they needed the vote essentially more than women did. When he was asked specifically about African American women, he said that in kind of a roundabout way that they would be represented by the vote of African American men. So he did not appreciate the intersectionality. Another prominent abolitionist and suffragist, of course, is also Sojourner Truth, who is pictured here. Sojourner Truth, who was illiterate and an escaped slave, but a remarkably well-known orator, was one who actually disagreed with Frederick Douglass. She wanted to see sex included into the okay, I see the question about iron-jawed angels. I will get to that when at the end. But Sojourner Truth advocated for including sex in the 15th Amendment, but was also an advocate for a variety of progressive causes. Here in the upper right-hand corner, we have Harriet Tubman. And Harriet Tubman, of course, is known for extraordinary bravery to help slaves escape from slavery and move into freedom and through the Underground Railroad. So she's an absolutely remarkable person. What you may not know is that after the Civil War, she settled in upstate New York, where she essentially ran a boarding house for wounded soldiers. But she also became active in the suffrage movement and was active in suffrage up until her death. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who is here on the bottom left, was also a very powerful orator. She traveled essentially the Susan B. Anthony on the African American side. She traveled around the country on this to advocate for suffrage and advocated that African Americans need to be included in the suffrage conversation. On the bottom right-hand corner here, we have Mary Church Terrell, who is a very good friend actually of Mary Chapman Catt and was active as kind of the second generation of suffragists. She founded the National Colored Women's Club Association, which really brought in educated, middle-class African-American women and brought them into the suffrage cause. So she was, they were advocating for a whole variety of social reforms, childcare, equal pay, advancement and educational opportunities, but suffrage was also always very high on the list, and she was very active in Nassau as well. So why was this such a big deal? I mean, because today we sort of take it for granted that people should be able to vote. Well, this is really how the suffrage debate broke down. What we saw was that the suffrage coalition, especially in the last 5 years, was made up of temperance, women's labor union movement members, progressives who just espoused a number of social reforms in the progressive era. As I mentioned, African American club women, and a number of men who believed that women were equal and needed to be able to participate fully in the political debate. But there was also extraordinarily well-organized and well-funded opposition. So if the temperance movement, which wanted to ban alcohol prohibition, right, was in favor of suffrage, the liquor industry arguably would be against it. And the liquor industry would say, when women get the right to vote, you're going to see your saloons closed. And that actually happened in some parts of the country. If you have industrial leaders, if you have the trade union movement in favor of suffrage, then it makes sense that industrial leaders would be opposed. The Catholic Church was also roundly opposed, along with traditionalists, because they believed that if women had the right to vote, it would undermine their moral authority and their role in the family. And then the South, which I will get to in a minute, was also steadfastly opposed. So while the suffrage movement especially was led by well-educated middle-class whites like Stanton, Anthony, Pat, and Paul, they really both movements were drew from women from many walks of life. And I also want to note that women were among those who were very ardently opposed to suffrage. So there were men in favor of women's suffrage, and there were women who were against it. So what were their tactics? The mainstream organizations, sort of typified by NASA, did the items that you see here listed on the left. And this was all sort of standard political fare of the 18th century, or excuse me, 19th century, early 20th century. So they worked to get suffrage planks in the party platforms. They tried to get a lot of news coverage. I'm trying to get my arms around news coverage of Carrie Chapman Catt, and there are over 9,000 mentions of her in newspapers.com. They would do leafleting and traditional lobbying and that sort of thing. The militant or the non-traditional suffragists, typified by Paul, they would campaign actively against the Democratic Party in the Western states as a way of trying to get women voters to oppose the opponents of suffrage, the party in power. They used parades, as I've already mentioned, including wagon tours and eventually automobile tours. And then, of course, we had the White House picket and other demonstrations. The suffrage debate in the South, however, was slightly different than what we saw in the rest of the country. So as I mentioned, some of these major forces that were involved in the suffrage movement in the American South were mostly irrelevant even if they were important outside the South, they were not important in the South. So the Catholic Church was not very prominent in the South, other than in parts of Louisiana and Texas, and a few isolated enclaves like Charleston and Savannah. The South was not industrialized, so having any sort of manufacturing opposition didn't make sense either. The liquor industry was also not as prominent because so many people in the South were teetotalers anyway. And the peace activists who partnered with the suffrage movement were not prominent in the South either. So what did that leave? It actually left a sort of uniquely Southern argument focusing on, guess what, states' rights. Prevalent across the South was the belief that the 15th Amendment was an overstretch of on the part of the federal government. And the fact that the federal government was not vociferously enforcing it meant that to the Southern mind, especially the Southern white mind, was that the rest of the country recognized that the 15th Amendment was a mistake. And so they did not want to repeat this mistake by allowing another major overstep of federal power by adding the 19th Amendment. Moreover, a lot of Southerners were opposed to suffrage because of this lost cause mythology that gained ground amongst white Southerners after the Civil War. And it sort of idolized the upper class white women who were the mistresses formerly of the plantation. And they were this paragon of femininity, and their job was to keep alive, think of the Daughters of the Confederacy, to keep alive the memory of the lost cause and the South at its height. And then finally, white supremacy was a not so veiled argument. If you remember back at the beginning when I showed you the language of the 19th Amendment, there is nothing in there that stipulates that the 19th Amendment is restricted to white women alone. Right? It does not say that white women shall be granted, right? And in fact, there were some efforts to add the word white to overcome Southern opposition. And Carrie Chapman Catt refused to go along with it. So she worked very hard to defeat any proposed amendments to add the word white to the 19th Amendment. But so it was widely accepted that the 19th Amendment would apply to African American women as well as white women. And Southerners who were in power, white Southerners in power, believed that this would then undermine white supremacy, which had really just sort of been, ensconced after 1876. And they would speak in extraordinarily candid ways. They would say, for example, we know what to do to keep black men from voting. Essentially, we know that we can just beat them up, and that will keep them from the polls. But we don't think that white men would feel comfortable beating up black women, that their sense of chivalry might get in the way. And so we would not be as effective in suppressing the black woman's vote as we are in suppressing the black man's vote. And so the threat to white supremacy became one of the main reasons for steadfast opposition to suffrage in the South. So how did the suffragists respond to this? Because both NASA and the National Women's Party really tried to be national organizations, and they knew that there was this issue of race in the South. And so one of the most prominent Southern suffragists, Kate Gordon, became an officer in NASA, and she worked with Carrie Chapman Catt. And as early as 1903, there was an attempt on NASA's part to appease Southerners and to bring them in. So at the 1903 national meeting, the NASA agreed to a plank that said that there could be an educational qualification, essentially a literacy test for people to be able to vote. Ultimately, the Southerners were ostracized from NASA, especially as NASA moved towards adopting a federal amendment, and they formed a rival organization, the Southern Suffrage Conference. And eventually, NASA did not spend any resources in the South during the last campaign. For the National Women's Party, Alice Paul's group here, they had to handle this as well. And so famously, the 1913 suffrage march in DC was in fact segregated. So African American groups such as the new sororities that were founded at Howard University that are part of the Divine Nine marched in this parade, but they were put at the back. Alice Paul criticized Carrie Chapman Catt for not focusing or spending any sort of resources in the South. She wanted to see if the South could ratify, even if that meant sort of selling out or accepting the fact that the South was going to disenfranchise African American women. And then after 1920, after NASA had disbanded and the National Women's Party was continuing, a number of African American suffragists from the South came to the National Women's Party to ask for help in dealing with the racial barriers that they were facing, the Jim Crow legislation that kept them from being able to vote. And they were turned down by the National Women's Party on the basis that the barriers that they faced were because of their race, not because of their sex. So now we get to the ratification struggle. The Constitution requires 2/3 majorities in the House and the Senate and 3/4 of the states to ratify, which was 36 of 48 states in 1920. The suffrage amendment passed the United States House of Representatives in 1918 by a margin of 1 vote. It passed the United States Senate a little more than a year later by a margin of 2 votes. And it also passed then, came down to the 36th state, which was Tennessee, in 1920. After Tennessee, there were only 4 states that had not otherwise voted on the suffrage amendment. And those 4 states were all expected to oppose the suffrage amendment. They were Florida and North Carolina as southern states that were not likely to ratify, but also Connecticut and Vermont, where the governors were steadfastly opposed to suffrage and refused to call the state legislatures into session to confront the suffrage amendment. So the final battle came down to a southern state in Tennessee. And the ratification debate in Tennessee went on for 6 weeks. Carrie Chapman Catt moved into the Hermitage Hotel. The Hermitage Hotel is this beautiful Beaux-Arts Victorian era hotel that's across the street from the Tennessee State Capitol. It was both the headquarters of the pro-suffrage forces led by Carrie Chapman Catt and the anti-suffragists who also set that up. The suffragists, the anti-suffragists also rented out a suite of rooms on the 4th floor where, even though this was prohibition, they had a 24/7 speakeasy that was funded by the liquor industry, and it was open to state legislators at any time of the day or night. There was sort of an interesting kind of twofold strategy going on here in Tennessee. One was that it was hoped that everybody, that the suffrage proponents would be so intoxicated all the time that they would sleep through the crucial votes. But then it was also an opportunity for the liquor industry lobbyists to bend the ear of the state legislators. So this went on. It was the Tennessee debate. If you're interested in reading more about it, it's an absolutely wonderful story. Is told very well by Elaine Weiss in her book, The Woman's Hour. But the Tennessee suffrage debate is also sometimes referred to as the War of the Roses, because the anti-suffragists used the red rose as their symbol, and the suffragists, the pro-19th Amendment forces, used the yellow rose. And they would give the roses of that particular color to the state legislators to wear in their boutonnieres so that they could be known for what their position was. And some of them actually kept a rose of each color in their pockets. So when they saw a lobbyist coming, they would just put the rose of the appropriate color in so that they wouldn't be bothered too much, because the lobbying was extraordinarily intense. The debate came down to a vote actually on August 18th. And when they were going into this vote, both the pro-suffrage forces and the anti-suffrage forces believed that the amendment was going to go down to defeat. They were both counting their votes very carefully, and the suffragists were sure that they were not going to get it, that they had just lost that many supporters. And as the vote went along, there were first a few procedural votes, and that seemed to lead them to believe that they were correct, that they were going to be defeated. And then in the end, when they were going through the final roll call vote, they get to Harry Byrne, who's a 24-year-old state representative from the mountains of Tennessee, who stands up while wearing his red rose in his coat lapel, and he votes aye in favor of the 19th Amendment. So quite unexpectedly to both the anti-suffrage and the pro-suffrage sides, they won by a margin eventually of 2 votes, because a few others for procedural reasons changed their vote. But it would not have happened without Harry Byrne. And so this became a big question as to why did Harry Byrne do this? And the reason was that morning he had received a letter from his mother, who was an ardent suffragist, and she wrote, "Harry, be a good boy and help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification." And so in the end, he then voted in favor of the suffrage amendment. And the 19th Amendment was and remains the single largest expansion of voting rights in the United States, enfranchising 27 million American women. So what happened then? Well, one thing that happened is that Carrie Catt founded the League of Women Voters. Was Harry Byrne reelected? Yes, he was. Thank you, Katarina, for that question. So she founded the League of Women Voters on February 14th of 1920. Why February 14th? Because February 14th was Frederick Douglass's birthday, and February 15th was Susan B. Anthony's birthday. And that was when NASA traditionally held their national meetings. What Catt and other suffragists expected was that women wanted the vote and that they would turn out in very high percentages in that women would block vote. They would vote for reforms and social change. What in fact did happen, they were kind of off the mark there for a while. It turned out that women did not vote differently from men, the men in their lives. So they voted their economic interests, their class interests, rather than interests as women as a unified group. And then secondly, that women did not turn out at high rates. Well, there was some variation in the states that tracked turnout by sex. We can estimate that it was about a 30% voter turnout. And that some women were prohibited from voting even with the 19th Amendment. Now, interestingly enough, no women, black or white, could vote in Mississippi or Georgia. Because both of Mississippi, the voter registration deadline had passed by August when the amendment was added to the Constitution, and the election officials refused to reopen registration, so no women were able to vote. In Georgia, the state legislature needed to pass some enabling legislation, and they refused to do that until 1921. Interestingly enough, African American women, a number of African American women in both South Carolina and Florida were allowed to register and did vote in 1920. However, eventually, Jim Crow laws were extended to cover African American women, and they were effectively disenfranchised across the South, along with the men in their lives, until the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And other women of color were disenfranchised for other reasons. So, for example, the Chinese Exclusion Act kept Chinese women, even if they were born in the United States, from becoming American citizens. Native American women were allowed to vote in 1920, but only if they gave up their tribal citizenship. If they did not want to give up their tribal citizenship, they were disenfranchised, just like Native American men were. And that was the case until 1924, when when the Snyder Act was passed, that removed that requirement. Now, fast forward 100 years. Now that we're in 2020, we are in the 26th presidential election since the 19th Amendment was passed. And today, women are the numerical majority of voters. Part of that has to do with the fact that women are a majority of the voting age population, about 52% of the voting age population. But it is also true that women vote at higher rates. So they are more likely than men to be registered to vote at about 80%, and they are more likely to cast a vote and vote at higher rates. So in 2016, this translated to 10 million more women casting votes than men in that presidential election. The second thing that we see is that starting in 1980, we see the development of a gender gap, where women are more likely to support Democratic candidates and Democratic proposals than are men. The largest gender gap up to this point was 11%, which occurred both in 1996 and in 2016, where there was an 11-point difference in support for Democratic candidates. The gender gap for 2020 is predicted to be even greater. By now, women have achieved parity in campaign donations as the number of donors. Women still give less money than men, but because of changes in the way that campaigns now raise money, where they try to get a lot of small donations from many millions of donors rather than a few very large donations from just a few people, that has meant that women are just as likely to donate to campaigns today. And that we have seen a number of reforms that have removed legal discrimination on the basis of sex. Nonetheless, women are still underrepresented in public life. And as of last night, my slide is out of date because now women are just 33% of the Supreme Court. But we do see that women are underrepresented across the country in terms of their election to state office or to serve in prominent positions in the private sector. And another big thing that is not done is that there is no constitutional protection of women's equality. So the Equal Rights Amendment to the United States Constitution has not been passed. It became the work that Alice Paul devoted her life to after the suffrage amendment. So it was first introduced in 1923. It was passed by Congress in 1972, but it failed to get the 38 states that were needed by 1982 when there was a deadline imposed. There has been some effort to ratify the amendment again by getting 3 more states to ratify and then using Congress to repeal the deadline, which was not in the constitutional amendment but in the legislation. So far that has not worked. There have been 3 more states that have ratified, but it has not moved forward anymore. So Alice Paul, who died in 1977, did not live to see her life's work achieved in the end either. So what would the Equal Rights Amendment do? It would make sex discrimination in the Constitution as important as racial discrimination. So racial discrimination is subject to what is considered the judicial standard of strict scrutiny, which means that if there is any perceived difference on the basis of race that is systematic by an employer, a government agency, anything like that, that it is incumbent upon the defendant to prove that they did not discriminate, right? So it's a very, very high standard for a defendant to achieve. Intermediate scrutiny, by contrast, does not assume that any disproportionate impact or difference of policy difference on the basis of sex is due to discrimination. So there is more pressure or more expectation on the part of the plaintiff to prove a discriminatory intent. So legally in the United States, sex discrimination is less important than racial discrimination. And to pass the Equal Rights Amendment would actually eliminate that difference. So let's have those questions. I saw one about iron-jawed angels. Can you repost that one, please?
Hi, Karen. I'm here to read your questions. The question comes from Dr. Jennifer Disney. She said, we showed iron-jawed angels earlier this semester for the Women's Suffrage Centennial Series. Aside from some fictionalized characters, how good of a job do you think this movie does in capturing the facts about the women and events you discussed today in the history of women's suffrage in the U.S.?
It does a pretty good job, and we showed iron-jawed angels here. The dramatization of the horrors of the jailing and the arrests and the forced feedings that I saw and have seen anywhere. It's very, very well done and very powerfully done. I think in terms of that, the whole portion of the film focuses on the women's treatment in the prisons. The only thing that is sort of fictionalized is that it appears that it was not well known and that there's this whole drama about somebody having to sneak out a message to her husband and things like that. It's fictionalized. It was actually very well known and widely known what kind of treatment the women received.
Thank you. We had one other question by text, which was, what happened in South Carolina during the suffrage movement? Were there any suffrage leaders in the state?
Yes, there were. One of my favorite ones is, golly, her first name is Nellie. She was active in sort of the second half of the suffrage movement. She became the first licensed realtor female realtor in South Carolina, and that was how she lived in Aiken, and that was how she supported her suffrage activities, and included things like pamphleting. She rented an airplane and she threw pro-suffrage pamphlets out of the airplane and things like that. There was also a significant effort when South Carolina was rewriting its constitution in 1895 to add women's suffrage at that point. It failed, but at least there was a vote during the Constitutional Convention, but it failed overwhelmingly because of, in no small part, the opposition of Pitchfork Ben Tillman, who's so well known on or notorious on the Winthrop campus for many reasons. And his argument was both racist and sexist. He didn't want to enfranchise African American women and wanted to keep women in their place. Interestingly enough, before Ben Tillman was elected, or after Ben Tillman was elected to the Senate and he died, there was a short-term senator who was appointed to fill the term briefly, who was the pro-suffrage senator, and at the time the U.S. Senate was 2 votes short, and so there was a real hope that the Senate might pass the suffrage amendment at that point because they were only 1 vote short, but they never picked up that additional vote, which they would have had to get elsewhere in the country. And there were some documented cases of some women from South Carolina who participated in the pickets at the White House, but they were pretty small and few and far between.
Thank you. Zoe Judd asks, how has the women's suffrage movement impacted or synchronized with feminism and the feminist movement?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. We refer to the suffrage movement in the United States as sort of the first wave of suffrage. And it was fundamentally based upon this notion that women were equal to men and should be able to participate fully in the political system. And suffragists really believed that once women went to the polls, that all sorts of other legal barriers that women and social conventions would eventually fall. I don't think they thought it was going to take as long as it did. And the second wave of American feminism came along because the expected reforms in terms of, reducing legal barriers and so forth just didn't happen. And so women then organized in the 1960s and 1970s especially to kind of move forward and to try and get the Equal Rights Amendment through. So there's a very clear connection from the suffragists to the second wave. And then the second wave feminism kind of gave way to what we refer to as the third wave, which focuses on many more local efforts, and that came along after after 1982 when the Equal Rights Amendment didn't pass. So that's where you see domestic violence shelters being opened and state level equal rights amendments being passed and things of that nature.
Thank you again. I found this presentation to be really informative and inspiring, and it reminds me why voting is so important for women today, particularly in South Carolina and in the South in general. So students who are on here, please don't forget to go vote absentee in person or submit your absentee ballot or vote in person on election day, and let's continue the progress that we've made. Dr. Chang also wants to thank you for your presentation and detailed lecture. She thinks it's going to be a great help for her students and students in general. And her comment is over on the right side. I want to make sure that you see that. So thank you for everything. We really appreciate your flyby return to Winthrop.
Yes. Well, I hope I can visit in person very soon. Let's hope for the pandemic.
Too. Yes.
Okay. All right. It was so good to see so many of you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Joined us today.